Right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Jake, just while we're at this point.
Yeah.
Ellen and Abby, what do you want this committee to get out of this? I mean, such a tsunami of data, but
Yeah.
do you have policy sort of bill requests or proposals or just things we should be thinking about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is more, and so for the record, Jake Claro, Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. So I think this is more about setting context for requests that are going to be coming to the committee. Really, as for Farm to Plate, we're representing, the plan, and this is the effort of many people in the food system and trying to give direction and priorities. And so I think, just a backstop to have to reference, and give context to where those requests might be coming from and why, their strategic importance or alignment. And also, yeah, and also with this data, just having that source to check of like, how does this line up with trends, or how does this address some of the barriers that might be identified in the information that we're presenting? And yeah, I did want to, just as I start to, just to kind of give like a couple of bullets of like things that I think should be taken away from this presentation from a, that you probably will be hearing more about from a policy standpoint. Um, and yeah, so does that?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay.
I would only add, Ellen Kaler, from the Sustainable Jobs Fund. I would only add that, for instance, one of the tasks you all have every year is to do your memo to the House Appropriations Committee. And so if any of this data can be used as additional, like the why this is important, right? There's always competition for available funds that are never enough. And so having this data at your fingertips to say, this is a growing industry, this is why this policy that we want to promote, or this funding request that we have, like it's all available to you to use as part of your why you're supporting things.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's great. Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna get going here and just do a quick kind of recap to get to where we left off. And some of you had asked some questions too that I have now some answers to. So just on there was a question about employment. So we covered a lot of the economics in the food system, and I think the big takeaway here is food and farming is a huge part of Vermont's economy. It has a huge economic impact. And within the farm and food economy, we have a diversity of industries. Certainly dairy is, the mature and large industry in the state, but we have an assortment of other production, that's starting to grow. And I think a big takeaway from that is those industries, need continued support for infrastructure investment, technical assistance, and market development. And so one of the questions was, what percentage of total employment does this 63,491 represent of people that are employed in the food system? It's 20.6% of total employment in the state. So just as Ellen was saying, like providing some of the why, that's a figure right there that I think is really impactful. And if you look at just farm operators, hired farm labor, and processing manufacturer employees, that's 9.2% of the total labor force of employees in the state of Vermont. So 20.6% in total, but if you look at just production and processing, that's 9.2%. So that was one thing that the question came up around. I'm just going to go through here. So what was the other one? Oh yeah, and then there was a question about, so again, we kind of went through all these economic indicators. There was a question about the local food sales, and so what percentage was alcohol or beverages as a part of that. So in 2017, beverages were about 25% of the total local food sales, and the majority of those beverage sales could be accounted for as beer, is the quick takeaway for that. And from 2014 to 2017, the growth in craft beverages or craft beer was about 17% of the total local food sales growth between 2014 and 2017. But the growth from 2017 to 2020 was not due to growth in the beverage sector. So just a little more context for that.
It's also the case that during that same period, we had a lot of tap rooms that were built. And a lot of Vermont food is served in those tap rooms. So you think about the beer hall, the Traps Beer Hall in Stowe, for instance, or Lawson's Finest in Waitsfield. Like the amount of food, local food that they're also moving, charcuterie boards, cheeses, those kind, fermented pickles, all of that stuff is also been really expanding. So along with the beer, of course.
Yeah, just another takeaway of that, our local food sales, they're spread across multiple market channels. So Vermonters have the ability to purchase or consume or be provided with local food in a number of different places. And I think where we have put investment into developing these markets for local food, we have seen increases in sales or access. So there's a direct line, I think, of efficacy in getting local foods into markets when we put our attention to it. We talked about grocery. This is just a huge part of spending and a huge opportunity, but one that also presents a lot of challenges for our producers. And this is where also infrastructure investment, is a big prerequisite oftentimes for accessing retail markets, whether that's for processing for value added, distribution infrastructure, storage infrastructure. You have to manage larger volumes, move larger amounts of product into the grocery channel.
I've been thinking about this, and like the next slide, you show the Dollar Generals and what's not, which we're not gonna crack into. They're not corporately not interested in what we do.
Yeah.
And you have the food co-ops up there, and we have one in Newport. And it's not convenient. And it almost serves, and don't throw stuff at me, it almost serves the niche market. They have a clientele that are dedicated. I got in there over Christmas. And it's a wonderful store. Marketing to broaden their marketing scope to everybody. I just.
Yeah, and absolutely. And showing the number of stores here, it's definitely, this is then the question of where does it make strategic sense to try and influence or change the purchasing or the of that store, or to help producers get in. And we were just talking the other day with some folks in New England about Dollar General to say the same thing, right? Like that's probably not the best choice for us to focus on. We have these 101 independent stores, which we've been doing programming with and helping them, increase their local products. But also we're thinking about, Hannaford's has regional and local purchasing commitments. So what are the more effective ways to work with their supply chain management teams? Yeah.
There you go.
And so, that is definitely, something that we're putting a lot of attention to. That's something that the New England region is putting a lot more focus into. To be very targeted and strategic with that.
I think that, it's a good point. And, it might seem like there's no way, you ever crack into the dollar stores. I remember though thinking like 10 or 12 years ago, you sort of stopping and recognizing that suddenly you could get organic food in like Cumberland Farms or the drugstores, which, not too long before that would have seemed like that would never happen.
Yeah.
that's a niche market and that's a, pretty small demand category. And then, that changed, that evolved.
Well, you think about the change that we've seen with the Maple Fields convenience stores. I mean, they are actually sourcing quite a bit of local product in all of their chain stores. The other thing I will say on the co-op side, every co-op is independent. So, for instance, the Hunger Mountain Co-op here in Montpelier or the City Market ones in Burlington, we know that during the height of the season, they're moving like 40% of all of the food going through those stores is local.
Oh, no doubt.
Right.
No doubt.
But I think your point is really important in that we need to be getting the non-co-ops to be upping their game. Because what the co-ops are doing, the biggest ones, they're doing tens of millions of dollars in local food sales. Like it is not like a drop in the bucket. And so if you have some stores that are doing 40%, and then you've got others like a Shaw's or a Hannaford's trying to get them up to 5, even 10%, like we're moving the needle then.
Well, it's like your independent stores, and I think of two in our area, and one's Newport Market, which used to be part of. It's a small chain of stores, the Newport Market, I think still has one.
Max.
Well, it's not Max.
It's now called Stowe Village Market.
Yeah,
It was previously Max, 15 months
It's
ago.
we have Newport Village Market, and they're all
Water.
same group, and of course, then we have the Derby Village Store, which is an IGA. And Derby Village Store is very good with like selling local produce.
Right.
But it's keeping them supplied consistently, so which is education on the producer. If you wanna crack into this market, but you need to keep them supplied, they don't wanna run out.
100%.
And the meat stuff seems to be going pretty good with these stores. I know, Frank Boyden is in real good at, which is all local.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and your Representative Nelson, you're also bringing up some important points about the readiness factor of producers themselves, and there's an education process there, and that's again why we think there's a lot of technical assistance and work to be done to help their business acumen to be successful in these markets, because if you fail or if you don't do something well one time, that could eliminate your possibilities for selling to those places in the future. So it's a very competitive environment. So it requires a lot of coordination and support for our producers to be successful there.
Representative O'Brien.
Just while we're on data, how do you account for, some of us border towns or like the Upper Valley, a ton of Vermont shoppers go to New Hampshire, same types of stores, but are they included in this, or is this strictly geographic?
Yeah, not in our local food purchasing estimates. So if those purchases are happening in New Hampshire, it wouldn't be accounted for. But as we think about sort of our New England strategy and accounting for the number of stores and thinking about developing better distribution, distributors don't just sell to a store in Vermont, and so that's part of the approach, is to really think about in getting on a distributor's truck, you're not only gaining access to a local market, you're potentially gaining access to stores across the border too.
Certainly a lot of Vermont food is sold at the two New Hampshire
Yeah.
in a co-op.
Yeah.
Vermonters buy.
Yes.
We go out in the state to buy Vermont.
Yeah. And we have some good relationships with folks at the Hanover Co-op, and they're very involved obviously in the Upper Valley region. So just kind of going through here. So we talked about direct sales and how there's this change in nature of evolving from just direct to consumer to now a lot of as that market has matured, now there's more direct to retail, direct to institutions, so our schools and universities, and also direct to food hubs. So we've got a number of food hubs across the state that are providing really essential distribution services to producers to access, new markets. And so we've seen some significant growth in that. And so when you add that all up, direct sales are increasing quite a bit. So then we got to land, so we're getting close to where we left off. And I think the main takeaways here are that farmland has been decreasing over time. Certainly, there are remaining pressures and challenges from development. So potentially, business as usual case, we could be losing another 41,000 acres. And American Farmland Trust has done some analysis of this, of where that farmland is particularly at risk. And also, we talked about a little bit about, outside of development pressures, there's a lot of just land use decision making that's happening, this year. A lot of reforms with Act 250, and just being mindful of still making sure there's protection for farmland, for prime agricultural soils, and that, balancing obviously, the housing and development needs of the state with the needs to ensure that we're protecting our land base so it can provide food security, food production for people that live here. And right now, one of the things that I want to reiterate on this is that, yes, dairy land has decreased over time. Some of that has shifted into crop production for livestock and for dairy. So we can't not think about the future of dairy farmland, because whether it transitions to other forms of production, livestock production, whether it stays in dairy and is a big part of our economy in that way, or how does it transition to smaller, other forms of production that require less land base, or are not, have not historically used such large pieces of land for their production. So we're talking a lot about, vegetable production, 30,000 acres, but only about 3,600 of those acres are actually in cropping year over year. So what does it look like for, a vegetable farm that's historically operating on 30 acres to then acquire and produce on land that's 200 acres? It's a much bigger jump. And in these conversations, there's a lot of also conversations about different land access models where multiple producers are perhaps purchasing or leasing. And there's a lot of, legal and financial elements to that present challenges to how those arrangements are structured. We've been working with Intervale Center on looking at those. And I think that's just a policy consideration to think about is, how do we promote and incentivize different types of ownership structure on farmland where it may require multiple owners to be operating, a large tract of land that traditionally was a sole operation. And then I think we're close to getting, our farmers are, farmland is also diverse as you start to look at it. So the majority of it is actually woodland. And cropland, pasture, and then the farmsteads and buildings. So farmers are also just managing a large diversity of types of land uses on their land, and that's quite unique. Think about how many other businesses are managing a woodlot, producing food, have open land. There's not many, and this is just kind of making a finer point on that. Our cropland is very dedicated to livestock production. And so when you start to look at cropland, there's that vegetable percentage is only 1% of cropland at 3,600 acres. So, vegetable production is growing, but it has currently a small footprint on the land base. And so again, just a lot of considerations for how does that expand, what types of support or incentives are needed to support the expansion of these other types of cropping that may not have historically used large tracts of land.
To meet the targets in the New England Feeds New England, are there some thoughts on how much acreage, say, for vegetables we need in the state?
Ellen
Yes.
probably has the, yeah, I should
I
have
have to
that.
look it up, but the calculation was that we need to bring about 1 million acres across the 6 states into production in total. Some of that would be grass-fed meats, livestock, but a large chunk, I'll look it up before I get in, I think it's a couple 100,000, so let me look it up.
Okay, so when we talk about this stuff and what I hear a lot of times is organic, is grass fed and whatnot. I assume we're not against conventional growing
No.
and, you know, more of a traditional, like our beef goes through our operations and they're fed refusals from our dairy cows. They do very, very, very well. We can hit fine
Yeah,
with our beef and so be gentle with your message because a lot of times those people in my world hear organic, they hear grass fed. And they say, well, they're not even interested in what I do.
Yeah.
And so that just, and I assumed you weren't. I just
Yeah.
wanna bring that to you with your messaging.
Yes.
Yeah,
thank you, that's-
and we are involved right now with a dairy beef project. That is, so it's working on crossing Wagyu genetics with Holsteins and that is a project that is working with conventional dairies, and also some producers who are in sheep and lamb production. So I think the message across the board is that we need all of it. It's
Thank you.
all of these things interrelate, and the success of one oftentimes impacts the success of another. We've definitely heard this around large animal vets, as conventional dairies have struggled. That limits the availability of large animal vets for others. Same with equipment. I think really looking at this in total and saying all of these things are important, and there's different ways that they contribute to the economy, environment, and community of Vermont. There's now, as I'm starting to get into some of the environmental stuff, we'll touch upon this a little more.
Just to answer Representative O'Brien's, it's going from currently 97,500 acres in vegetables across the 6 states to 235,000 to get to 30%. So quite a large increase.
So
We only have 3,000 out of that 97,000.
A lot of it's potatoes in Maine.
Yeah, the county, potatoes and broccoli.
yeah.
Yeah, it's huge.
So water quality, there has been tremendous work at the state level around water quality, addressing water quality issues and phosphorus. And this, I have to thank the agency. They have a great dashboard that you all can find this information on, as does the Agency of Natural Resources. But over a period of time from 2016 to now, over 493,000 acres of conservation practices have been implemented, and over 200,000 kilograms of phosphorus have been reduced through those practices. So, we're seeing real impact through that work, and I'll get into this a little more. But here's just a look at. Let me minimize this. So, as investment and money and resources have been put into water quality practices, we have seen real uptake in implementation over time. And the 2024 number there is not a full fiscal year yet. So that number likely will be around that 120,000 acres of implemented practices. So we're seeing, real on the ground impact through the investments, technical assistance, and work of our farmers to implement those practices. And, on the whole, the majority are in cover cropping, manure injection, nutrient management, but we've seen some other practices emerge over time, like precision ag, rotational grazing, reduced tillage. So a very diverse mix of types of practices. And then again, to reemphasize, this has led to significant phosphorus reductions, and I'm going to get into the cost effectiveness of that. But you can see that, as these practices are implemented, they do have real impacts on phosphorus.
Yeah, sorry. Go back to that
Yeah.
slide again for a second. And were you gonna say something, Abby?
Sure, please.
No, I'll let you.
So for the record, Abby Willard, Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, I just wanted to make just sort of like a plug for this case study success of cover cropping. So, I mean, you can just see the kind of like the tremendous growth in cover cropping, conservation practice implementation. Before I came to the agency in 2011, I worked for the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District, and we spent many years sort of doing some cover cropping pilot projects on farms to sort of say, try this practice, it's great, it works well, it's good for your soil, and fewer passes across your fields, you'll have fuel reduction benefits, you'll see crop yield improvements. And it was a really hard sell. We worked specifically on a pilot project in the Mad River Valley, primarily because there was a lot of traffic that would drive kind of the main route and see brown fields in the winter, and there was a lot of concern around kind of pollution inputs to the Mad River. And that population of agricultural producers was really willing to be kind of like part of this pilot to like see if it would improve neighbor relations, and then if they would see environmental benefits, water quality improvements, and then sort of like other phosphorus reduction and cost effectiveness as a farm. What we found in that project, which I think is very applicable to so many of these other kind of water quality improvement practices, is that we needed farmers to tell farmers about the practice being valuable for them. So once there were farmers that had had success and felt like it had worked for their operation, for them to tell their neighbors and members of their community that it was working well. We also needed to like have data to show them that like it was making a difference, like it was saving them in fuel costs, it was resulting in crop yield or organic matter growth. And then for us to actually support for the practice to be supported, we had to incentivize it. And so then that resulted in Vermont government at that time, with support from other organizations, providing cost share assistance programs to sort of like ease the entry burden for farms to adopt a practice. And if you then look at like 34% of the conservation practices across the state is now cover cropping, it's like truly an example of when you combine farmer to farmer education, cost share incentivization, and sharing the data, like best practices are implemented.
The two things I wanted to just clarify, that these are reductions, and it's reductions against some baseline figure that was established in 2015 or prior to.
Yeah, and and these are modeled figures, so it's,
And then just, I don't know whether you were going to comment on the 2024 bar being lower, quite a bit lower than the previous 2 years.
Yeah, so like so the acres of practices, 2024 is an incomplete fiscal year right now, so that number should be closer to the previous years.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Representative Nelson.
We did 1,000 acres this year, by far the most we've ever done. We put a dedicated kid from after school. He drove out, got in the drill and just drilled till dark. I wouldn't let him go past dark because he just got his license. So we did 1,000 acres and
1,000 acres of what?
cover cropping. And the response from the community and the response from the 80, soon to be 83-year-old previous owner, my father, it's been unbelievable. He just says, why don't we do that on every acre? That is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And our neighbors are all Everybody, it's a win-win-win. You can take that to your farmers. It just, your community gets behind it. The deer love it, the turkeys love it, the geese love it. And next late June, when the dirt hits 75 degrees and that cover crop breaks down, and the corn loves it.
Mm.
But it is another management tool, and there is real cost to it. All the costs, all the incentive money we got went to purchasing seed.
Yeah.
That's how come we could do so many acres. We eat we got a grant for you for partial payment on a two smallest cedar. It's only 15 foot, it needs to be 30, but someday we will go beyond. And so, some farms can't eat that cost of application, so they use that money for all of its seed and application costs, I believe. But we used it all to purchase seed.
And we'll get into this a little more too with some of the sort of like climate related elements, but there's a lot of co-benefits to these practices for carbon sequestration, for wildlife and other environmental quality related issues. And also a lot of these programs are year over year oversubscribed, and so just really essential, that incentive is there, and also that there's people along the way that can help farms make these transitions or help with the management changes that come with it. So and then just on the cost effectiveness side, investing in these practices is tremendously cost effective. So this graphic is a little wonky. It's called like a box and whisker graph. And what it's showing is basically the variance from there's a mean or a median in here, and then the top line is the maximum value that you could see, and then the bottom line would be the minimum value. So you're seeing the variance that basically makes up the average. And so, agriculture by far is the most cost-effective investment that you can make so for every dollar invested, you get a kilogram of phosphorus reduction at a lower cost than these other categories.
This was a question that came up. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but last year when we were having the conversation about forestry practices, logging practices, and whether we wanted to take some money from the Clean Water Fund or from another source and help that sector of the economy with their reduction. Some of the pushback that we got was, I think, related to this, that if we put those resources in there, then we don't have them for here, and which one is ultimately more cost effective? So I think that's partly what this is showing us. Yeah. But at the same time, we're not ignoring stormwater runoff or transportation or any of the other ways, and we shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's a both and what can fund these different categories is also different. And I think the takeaway for me and maybe for the committee as well could be that if the question arises as to why are we putting so many dollars into these agricultural practices, the response to that could be, well, it's incredibly effective in order to meet phosphorus reduction goals, and as we'll talk about, it's also important for other co-benefits. So
Representative Brown.
More for you, Abby. Is there any tracking done of essentially agricultural land that's no longer being farmed, so not developed, but it's just out there, that was marginal. Farms are constantly going sort of out of business with the dairy farms, and then fields don't get hay, they start to become, grow back into shrubbery and forest. good for phosphorus reduction, probably good for water quality in a lot of ways, but, you know, as far as this conversation about agriculture goes, maybe potentially turn back into agriculture, but I just wondered if that's gotta be a large amount of acres in the state. And I'm just
Like we
neutral on
typically,
it, like,
like,
is this good, is this bad, what is
we
this?
refer to it as like fallow land,
Right,
right? So it's
exactly.
not returned to forest yet, it's not under current cultivation or
Right.
annual cropping. And it's, yeah, reverting back naturally to kind of its forest state.
So that's another thing that New England Feeding New England, as part of its estimates for that 30 by 30 goal, did analysis around.
Yeah, so out of that million acres, 500,000 in the region would need to be new acres, and like 490,000 acres would be reverting that fallow, unutilized land back into more intensive, productive kind of ag use. I think we capture it through the census, but it shows up as like other ag land, and it's a pretty big percentage. I feel like it's like 20% or something, I can't remember
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's and that amount of other land that's not in kind of active production does shift when our farm use changes, or our farm sizes change, or the production kind of practice changes, either fields are too small, or the equipment's too big, or it's too difficult to reach, or it's not easy to graze, or, it's not the right drainage for tillage. There's a lot of reasons why kind of land that's not kind of like prime agricultural soil, or, the best fit for the operator's intent, it kind of gets neglected.
Yeah,
But I think the New England report, as Jake referenced, like, recognize that that is land that's not developed. It is at least, likely of statewide significant soil, so it's good soil. It may not be the best soil, but it's still like, well suited for ag production. And it could be, revitalized, like brought back into production.
Yeah.
That's an answer to your question.
Yeah, Abby, a lot of that soil, in my world, we call it tough land. Rocky, it could be wet. We would have to get A&R to allow significant improvements to happen on that land. And I mean, if we could subcategorize it towards the vegetable farming aspect, I mean, things grow in dirt. And so your first requirement is to have soil, unless you're going to be hydroponic and infrastructure. Your first requirement is to have soil, but you've got to have that soil so you can work it. I drive by a whole bunch of it when I come in here every day. And, and I look at it, I hate that. Yeah. But what I'm saying, and then elevation. You get above 1,200 feet, things don't grow the same, but your cool season crops would be phenomenal up there. Your spinach, your lettuce, your beets, your whatnot, carrots, root crops. But we would really have to crack A&R on that, because it would, you see what they do when you go to Montreal, if you ever go up towards Montreal. That's all swamp up there. And they've got that tile drain in a carpet matter, ditches every so many feet. They're controlling the water, and they've taken that land, that black earth land, and made it incredibly productive. There's a place up in Granby that's incredible. Like that means better soil. But up towards Montreal, and I go on all day about this stuff. But anyway, there's things that we should look at to promulgate. There's my $5 word for the day. To promulgate vegetable farming, like not 50,000-60,000 pound equipment out there, but your good Kubota tractor you saw with the cultivator on it, that could work. It just needs help to get established. Heather could work that land and do very well with it, with her grazing and her vegetables. It just, you need help to get it. And then you're fighting someone because it's got a view you're fighting that aspect. So that's where you get with,
We should probably.
yeah,
Keep going here.
committee discussion.
Well, and yeah, a committee discussion that could relate is also emergent agroforestry practices. So really trying to integrate trees and shrubs into other types of agricultural production. So those marginal lands could potentially be a good fit for a lot of innovation that's happening in the state in that industry. So turning to greenhouse gas emissions and climate, when we look at the emissions profile of the state, so agriculture is almost 16% of the estimated greenhouse gas emissions as part of the greenhouse gas emission inventory. And then the graphic here on the left-hand side is looking at by sector what the emissions targets are, that dotted line for 2025. So right now agriculture is above the target, as are all of the others aside from electricity. So there's progress here to be made, and agriculture is a portion of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And where those emissions are coming from is primarily associated with livestock. So you've got methane emissions coming from livestock plus associated manure management. But then there are also emissions from soils that are associated with all types of production, depending on the practices. So for almost 50% are from livestock, and then another almost 30% from the manure management associated with that.
That word is enteric.
Yeah, enteric fermentation. Yeah, so that's the way that ruminants process the food they eat, and it produces methane as a result.
CH4 methane.
Yeah, CH4 is methane. Yeah.
And the liming and urea fertilization, that's a small number. We can't see it on the screen.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, and it's so 2%. So that's related with soil management.
So, and just noting that the numbers haven't changed, and the total hasn't changed very much over the
That's right.
years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty stable emissions profile, which also speaks to, as we look at this more and put more attention to it, there's a lot of potential to introduce, practices that do reduce emissions. And there's a lot of interest in looking at, feed management, for livestock. And there are ways to kind of change the amount of emissions, that comes out of a cow, through feed. And, so there's attention being put to that, and manure management as well. But on the other side of it, so, we can look at, emissions, and, a lot of that's associated with livestock, but there's a lot of net sequestration that's coming from agricultural land and also associated with those livestock operations. So these are estimates for the carbon that's sequestered through the conservation practices that have been implemented for water quality. And again, there's this kind of co-benefit that comes from things that help water quality are also oftentimes associated with sequestration of carbon. And so that over this 3-year period, if we take the maximum amounts so the other thing is there's variability here in measurement. So depending on the time of year you're measuring or a change in practice that could happen on that land, right? You could have a change in the amount of carbon that's sequestered. Also, soil depth, there's variations of where you're measuring. So there's still a lot of variation in these estimates, but the overall message is that these soils do sequester carbon. And if we take the max value, the practices implemented for water quality would have a net sequestration impact of equivalent to taking almost 7,000 cars off of the roads in Vermont. So these are real, very significant carbon reductions, carbon sequestration that can come from agricultural land. So, ag land again has a really important role to play in meeting climate goals for the state.
Can I just make a note to come back at some point to dig into this a little bit more, like which practices are contributing the most?
Ryan Patch at the agency is the perfect person to talk about this. Also, there's some UVM researchers that have done a lot of work, and a woman, Alyssa White, who's now at American Farmland Trust, did a lot of survey work for sort of the state of soil quality in Vermont. And that work provided a lot of estimates for not only, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, not only for like organic matter and phosphorus, but also for carbon. So she's got a wealth of knowledge too. But I think Ryan was probably in some ways associated working on that too, so he could speak to a lot of this. And the agency has more has more data on this and more estimates around those specific practices. Yeah.
I just wondered if, thinking of agriculture in general, I have no idea whether if we added up, say, all the CO2 emissions from tractors and trucks versus just the off-gassing of methane from all our livestock, like, which is, far worse, in that way. I have no idea.
Let's give Jake a chance to.
Yeah, I think going back to this slide is, just considering the overall estimated emissions of agriculture being about 16%, and then transportation right now being the second largest contributor to emissions at 35.6%. So now that doesn't compare like a 1-to-1, like a vehicle versus a cow, and
Right.
But also consider that agriculture is like 20% of the land base. So, on a per acre basis, the greenhouse gas emissions contribution is pretty low. So, you start converting that land into development, and that brings a whole host of new emissions potential on a per acre basis. And so, there's obviously a lot of complexity of and variables that you could change to impact those estimates.
Just from a policy standpoint, right, would it make more sense to go electric with our farming, fleets? Or
Right, I see what you're saying.
would it make more sense to transition to more non-livestock farming?
Right.
So why don't we get Representative Nelson's question, then I'm just looking and thinking.
Yeah, and we're almost.
Yeah, we'll then maybe let you finish up the few slides that are left in this presentation, then take our break.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Our industry has a real interest in actually being able to measure what our carbon footprint is between, what we output and what we sequester.
Yeah.
And looking at all of it, our ag land, our soils, our timber that we own. And we ask the question and people go, it would be nice for us to know what other additional practices we can take. Because what a selling point would be, you buy our milk, we have, a zero carbon footprint or a negative carbon footprint. So industry really would like to know where that is.
Yeah, and I definitely
We care.
I definitely think that Ryan could provide some really good insight on that, and there's a lot of questions around the accounting for this, because agriculture is unique as a land use type in its potential to sequester, and the way that the state is accounting for emissions reductions targets it's a gross emissions target, so it doesn't account for the sequestration potential. But I think if you look at that potential, agricultural land could potentially sequester the amount of carbon needed in order to meet our net emissions goals. And so one thing I sort of get into this just a little bit more, but one thing that's interesting about this is this group that Alyssa White was involved with doing this state of soil health in Vermont, which is a 2022 report. They looked at a number of different types of management scenarios that also included nutrient management and some other things. But one of the things they also took a look at was there's an association of soil organic matter and carbon that's sequestered. And what they looked at and analyzed was if there was a 0.1% increase in soil organic matter per year on corn and hay fields, that would meet the agricultural reduction targets alone, and actually exceed. And it would not only meet it for the near term targets, but also for the 2050 reduction levels. So soil management, soil organic matter is a really critical component to our climate future and our water quality future. And so there's, again, just a real cost, I think a cost efficiency and a huge potential that is still, a lot of really great work that's happened here, but a lot of great work can still continue. And then just the last, so shifting kind of the gears here to now just touch upon food access and security. I think this committee has heard from a number of folks who work in this world, and so I'm really going to try to just reiterate some key points. But food insecurity rate, there's been a lot of recent activity in measuring this in the state of Vermont. USDA has been the sole source for this data historically, and consistently provides estimates. So these are each of these data points too is a 3-year rolling average. Is just another thing to account for. But the thing that I think is interesting in this trend line is that Great Recession, we see a huge uptick in the food insecurity rate. COVID-19, we see actually a measured decrease by USDA. So why is that? Well, over the period during COVID, the SNAP benefits per participant through the COVID funding increased 102%. So from $122 on average to $247 in 2021. Now, as that funding is starting to go away, the food insecurity rate now is starting to increase again. And what I would say as well around this is that the 9.2% for 2023, remember that's a rolling average. So it's likely that the individual 2023 year is higher than the 9.2%. And this is a bit of an early warning of probably the 2024 percentage will be higher because it's going to include larger numbers in that 3-year average. So I think, just to take that into account is probably this 9.2% is a lower kind of estimate than the actual value because it lags behind the current year because it's a 3-year average. So, we know a lot of Vermonters, are struggling and inflationary pressures are also definitely an important factor here. And then this is research from Meredith Niles, who I think presented to the committee. And so, just reiterating this point of there are a number of factors that present challenges for food access, but the most clear one between a food secure person and someone who's reporting as food insecure is a lack of money. And we saw in that previous slide that as benefits increase, as funds become available to a person or a household, the food insecurity rate declines. Now, of course, you could consider there's sort of SNAP benefit increases, and there's also, this is a conversation too around wages and economic development, because as people obviously are earning more, they have more resources to provide to their families. So, lack of money is obviously a very significant driver of this, but there are some other factors: transportation, locations that are open or available, accessible, and some other factors too. And then, USDA does certain measurements, but also the Meredith Niles and a research team tracked food insecurity among Vermonters over COVID. And this was a population that was representative demographically, but did have a higher rate of food insecurity than the general Vermont population. But you could see in that population that kind of a similar trend of, when COVID first came, those people being vulnerable to food insecurity. As more stimulus dollars came to the state, that the rate started to decline. And then as those dollars recede and inflation increases, food insecurity rates increase. So also insecurity is not, there's variation in what types of populations experience it. It's not it's not some, an average includes a lot of different values that go into it. So if you look at it by race and ethnicity, people of two or more races experience food insecurity at higher rates. And basically, most non-white populations experience food insecurity at higher rates than the average. And then we can also look at this for LGBTQ plus. This was New England, but beyond being straight and male, essentially, all other populations here experience food insecurity higher than the average. So, different populations experience food insecurity at different rates. So it's not something that you can just think through and think about through one lens. There's a lot of nuance and complexity to thinking about how to address food insecurity across these different populations. And also disability status as well is a huge factor in predicting whether or not a household will be experiencing food insecurity. Pretty clear across the board that these different factors are predictors of whether or not someone will be higher than average. And I think that is it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. I know that it's a lot of information and just speaking that much can be exhausting. So,
My mouth is very dry.
well, our break is as much for you as it is for us. Would 10 minutes be a good break time? Okay. All right, well, let's pause then.